Now we have Professor Erickson from the Gun Museum, who I think will get a little more in depth about on a lot of the questions that we were asking about the impacts or the positive tax impacts. Thank you.
Welcome. All right. I like this committee already. Go bathroom break.
They go to the bathroom on their own.
So thank you for the introduction. My name is Jon Erickson. As Representative Klein said, I'm a professor in ecological economics in the Richest School of Environment and Natural Resources at the University of Vermont, and also a fellow at the Gun Institute for Ecological Economics, one of our major research institutes at our state university. I have over 20 years of research experience specific to energy and climate change, economics, and policy. It's the subject that I got my teeth on in graduate school, my dissertation on, and so it's wonderful to see old wine in new bottles. These subjects that come around again and again and again. A lot of my work in this area has been funded by Cornell University, by the National Science Foundation, and by San Diego National Labs. I want to first say thank you. Thank you to the House Natural Resources and Energy Committee for taking testimony this week on proposals for a carbon pollution tax. Thank you to the Ways and Means Committee for holding today's joint hearing to discuss the economic and fiscal impacts of one, putting a price on carbon pollution. Two, this is very implicit in Scott's presentation, shifting the burden of our state's current tax system off the middle class and the most economically vulnerable in our state. And three, investing in statewide energy efficiency and our clean energy transition. The carbon pollution tax proposal being discussed today is, in the end, a very straightforward approach to fair tax reform, economic development, and reduction of our unsustainable reliance on fossil fuels and impact on our environment. The strategy is tried and true, and it's very simple. We want to put a tax on the things that we don't want, in this case pollution. We want to shift taxes away from what we do want, for example, jobs, and invest in the only long-term viable future for our economy, one without non-renewable carbon-polluting energy. So in today's testimony, I want to provide some of the big picture context. I'd like to first provide a broader context on the widespread support of taxing carbon pollution from the economics profession. Second, summarize the broad national and subnational experience with energy and pollution taxes, highlighting the recent experience of the Canadian province of British Columbia with taxing carbon pollution. And third, extend these lessons learned from decades of analysis and experience with carbon and other pollution taxes to the context of our state. First, I can speak from experience that it's often difficult to get economists to agree on just about anything. However, today, economists of all stripes have been lining up behind national and state level carbon pollution tax proposals. From the left to the right side of the political spectrum, economic advisors stretching from the Nixon through the Reagan to the Clinton and Obama administration have argued for carbon tax reform. Some of the more highly profiled figures include George Shultz, former U.S. Secretary of Labor and Secretary of Treasury under President Nixon, and Secretary of State under President Reagan. Alan Blinder, former Vice Chair of the Federal Reserve and member of President Clinton's Council of Economic Advisors. More recently, Larry Summers, former Secretary of the Treasury and Director of the National Economic Council for President Obama. Also Nobel laureates, spanning the range from economic philosophies from Gary Becker of the University of Chicago to New York Times columnist and Princeton professor Paul Krugman. And panels of economists that have been assembled over the last 2 decades to study the economic impacts of climate change. From research reports to op-eds, all call for tax reform that would put a price on carbon pollution to achieve true market efficiency, every economist's dream, use the proceeds to shift the tax burden off the backs of the middle class, the so-called double dividend of pollution tax reform, and invest in economic competitiveness through a clean energy transition. These economists speak from an established tradition in my field. Hindsight. What you're seeing here is the attempt of some foresight, but it's much easier to sort of figure out what has happened in the past and whether it's been successful or not. Every nation on earth, and I can't stress this enough, every nation on earth taxes energy in order to invest in national infrastructure. Every nation on earth taxes pollution to discourage waste and encourage efficiency. And a growing number of countries have direct experience with carbon pollution tax, some now for over 20 years. We have a lot of experience to draw from, but unfortunately in recent decades, much of this experience in energy and pollution tax reform comes from nearly every nation in the world except our own, except the United States. So let me give you some context, and then we'll circle back around to what does this mean for Vermont. All countries have access to the same petroleum prices of international markets, but each impose taxes at different levels. As a general rule, richer countries have higher prices, while poorer countries and the countries that produce and export oil have significantly lower prices. One notable exception to that general rule is the United States. So the April 6th average price of gasoline around the world today, is $4 a gallon. The April 6th U.S. average price is $2.61 a gallon, 65% of the global average. The only countries with only higher, our current gas price is only higher than 23 other nations nationwide, and most of those are either OPEC countries or low-income nations. A little more context. Of the 28 member nations of NATO, the North American Treaty Organization, only the U.S. has a gas price below $3 a gallon. Only the U.S. and Canada have a gas price below $4 a gallon. The current average price of gasoline for NATO countries without the 2 American members is $5.62 a gallon, more than twice the U.S. average. Perhaps not surprisingly, the U.S. and Canada consume more energy per capita than nearly every other nation in the world, among a group of energy elites that include OPEC nations and a handful of small wealthy nations. Each average American consumes nearly 4.5 times more energy than the average global citizen. Again, not surprisingly, our CO2 emissions per capita are far, far above all but just a few nations in the world. All but one of the nations with higher CO2 emissions per capita than us are among that small group of nations with lower energy prices. In Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, Iran, and there's the US and Canada. If we focus on the richest nations in the world, the 34 countries belonging to the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, the story of the U.S. as an anomaly on the energy tax spectrum is even more revealing. The OECD recently did an analysis of the effective carbon pollution taxes of their member states. So looking at all energy-based taxes and converting those taxes, whether they were specific to carbon or not, converting those energy-based taxes into effective carbon taxes. What does the picture look like? In effect, the current range of federal carbon pollution taxes among the wealthiest nations in the world, among the OECD nations, ranges from $4 a ton to $141 a ton. So I'll give you some context of Scott's simulation there of how this would ramp up. It's still well within the OECD range. You might guess that the U.S. is at the very bottom of this range, just above Mexico at $6 a ton. While the world outside of OPEC, Canada, and the U.S. has been ratcheting up taxes on fossil fuels for decades, at the federal level, the U.S. gas tax has been the same for over 2 decades, for over 20 years. Remember this number, 18.4 cents per gallon. It's been stuck for 20 years while the rest of the world keeps ratcheting up gas taxes to get off the fossil fuels. Now that's federal. As you know, all 50 states in the U.S. tax gasoline, diesel, and other fossil fuels, all 50 states. In fact, the range of state motor fuel taxes as of April 1st, including both excise and other fuel taxes, and Vermont has both, stretches from 29.7 cents per gallon on the low end, that's Alaska, that's the lowest state fuel taxes, to 70 cents per gallon on the high end in Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania, California, New York are the top three. Okay, so that gives you a sense of the range of current state gas taxes across the country, from 29 to 70. That's a 40-cent spread. Vermont is currently 1/100th of a cent above the national average. Okay, so there's some below us, some above us. We're right about the national average at 48.86 cents per gallon if you account for both our excise tax and our other energy taxes and put them together. Currently, as of April 1st. In the Northeast, we're below New York. Our energy taxes are below New York, below Connecticut, and below Rhode Island. We're about the same as Maine. We're about 4 cents higher than Massachusetts and 6.5 cents higher than New Hampshire. So New England together is in that kind of range of energy taxes that is within 4 to 6 cents of each other. Also, although the federal gas tax hasn't budged in over 20 years, it's important to note that state gas taxes have, especially over the last few years. Since 2013, 11 states have increased gas taxes, including Vermont, and just in the last few weeks, including South Dakota and Utah. Another 6 states have passed bills in at least one chamber this year to increase gas taxes, and another 7 states have active proposals that have momentum, that have political momentum. And we like to be first. I know that could be neat, but this is happening right now. Outside of gas taxes, besides Vermont, there are carbon pollution tax proposals, as you've heard about in Washington, California, Massachusetts, and perhaps some others that I'm not even aware of. Much of this recent return to state gas taxes is to plug holes in a growing gap in transportation infrastructure funding. So let's be clear, that's been the purpose of this wave of gas taxes. The major difference in carbon pollution tax proposals are the tax shift elements and the investment in a new energy infrastructure. When coupled with broader tax reform and reinvestment in locally sourced renewable energy and efficiency, as you heard from the REMI study, energy taxes have generally, and carbon pollution taxes more specifically, can have positive economic and environmental outcomes for a state like Vermont. Probably the most talked about current actual, not effective, but actual carbon tax example is the case of British Columbia. Let me highlight a few of those. Now, in hindsight, what has happened since that was implemented in 2008. British Columbia started with a carbon tax of $10 a ton in 2008, so on the way low end of that effective carbon tax rate that we see in OECD countries. Remember, Canada and the US are an anomaly here with low energy taxes in general. And then they incrementally raised the gas tax, the carbon tax, broad-based carbon tax, just like is being discussed here in Vermont, incrementally raised to $30 a ton by 2012. And it's been, so that graph for Vermont, 10, ratchet up to 30, and then flat at 30 since 2012. So from about 9, if you put this in gasoline tax, a broad-based tax on all fossil fuels, but if you put this in terms of gasoline tax, that's about 9 cents a gallon up to about 25 cents a gallon over that period. As you might know, the British Columbia law was revenue neutral by law, with broad tax rebates and targeted benefits to low-income and rural households. It was passed through a coalition that stressed tax fairness, government efficiency, and pollution reduction. Okay, so it was a broad coalition that came together for this carbon pollution tax. Now we have 6 years of data to analyze the British Columbia example and find that revenue neutrality was judiciously maintained, perhaps because by law the finance minister is required required to take a 15% pay cut if the tax is not revenue neutral. That's been maintained. The province of British Columbia now has the lowest personal income tax in Canada. British Columbia also has one of the lowest corporate tax rates in Canada and actually one of the lowest in North America. The British Columbia economy has about as modestly outperformed the rest of Canada, so carbon tax policy didn't by itself do any damage to the British Columbia economy. And here's the kicker, right? They saw a 16.1% decline in fuel use over this very short period of time, while the rest of Canada saw a 3% increase. Okay? 16% decrease in fuel use, recycling of that carbon tax revenue into other programs throughout the economy, modest improvement of their economy as compared to the Canadian growth rate as a whole. They were successful because it was incremental, okay, so there was time to adjust, which we were discussing with Scott. Energy consumption is indeed very inelastic in the short runs, meaning not very responsive to a price range. However, there's a lot of evidence to show that energy prices are more elastic in the long run. Okay, so it's really difficult for us to quickly react to changing energy prices. That's why when they're out of our control, they often do much harm to the economy. But when they're in our control and they can be done on schedule, we have time to make those adjustments. British Columbia was also successful because their plan was tied to tax reform, a tax shift to more than overcome the regressive nature of consumption-based taxes. Consumption-based taxes are regressive, and so you have to do something to combat that regressiveness. Although successful, they left a lot on the table, and they recognize that now. I mean, they were a leader in 2008. They were successful. They left a lot on the table with a small size of the tax and a lack of direct funding to the local renewable energy and efficiency economy. The next increments in British Columbia are now being discussed. Okay, so the law said go from 10 to 30 to 2012, and then left it open after that. And just recently, the province of Ontario has announced that they will pursue a carbon pollution tax this year. So you're starting to see what happens when one province, in this case, leads and the others start to follow. There are certainly good lessons to be learned for Vermont carbon pollution tax policy. The results of the economic modeling in the revenue study that you just heard about certainly mirrors the experience of British Columbia, as well as other national carbon tax shift policies implemented in Europe, specifically the example of Germany. I've thoroughly reviewed the revenue study, and in fact, I had the opportunity to discuss the model at length with Scott. By my estimation, the results are actually a very conservative estimate of the economic benefits to Vermont, from strategy to tax carbon pollution, shift the tax burden, and reinvest a small portion into our state's energy transition. Also, these results are cast in traditional economic terms of jobs and gross state product. And Scott makes no bones about that. That's the purpose of the study. I had the opportunity a few weeks ago to update the House Committee on Natural Resources and Energy on Act 113 and our ongoing work of providing annual estimates of Vermont's genuine progress indicator to help guide state policy and economic planning. This is many of you voted for, a more holistic, a more thorough way of looking at the health of the Vermont economy by trying to account for not just the benefits of the growing economy, but the costs. Currently, the largest drags on the Vermont economy's capacity to produce genuine additions to our well-being of our citizens, so when the full benefits and costs of our economy take into account, include growing income inequality. Only Montana's economy grew more inequitably than Vermont since 2006. Substantial dependence on non-renewable fossil fuels, especially in transportation. An above average, national average cost of commuting for Vermonters, and our contribution to the economic costs of carbon pollution. Small be it may, it's our contribution to that still has an impact on the Vermont economy. A carbon pollution tax has obvious benefits to our economy as measured by traditional metrics such as gross state product, largely because of that recycling of the revenue. Why export our money for something that we don't produce when we can reinvest it in something that we do. But those benefits are further magnified by this broader indicator of the genuine progress indicator, by reducing our dependence on fossil fuels, reducing our heavy commuting costs by incentivizing a less carbon-intensive transportation sector, and ultimately reducing our carbon pollution. Maybe less obvious, and I'll wrap up here, maybe less obvious is the ability of a tax shift through pollution tax reform to reduce the growing income and wealth inequalities in our state. All 50 states, again, some context here, all 50 states have regressive tax policies that put more of the tax burden on the poor and middle class than those with higher incomes. Vermont's state and local tax system in aggregate is less regressive than most, so that's good news, it's something to celebrate, but is regressive nonetheless, with signs of growing more regressive in recent years. The Nonpartisan Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy recently released their 5th edition of their distribution analysis of tax systems in all 50 states. After adjusting for federal deduction offsets, the top 1% of income earners in Vermont pay 7.7% of their family income in state and local taxes, while the poorest 20% of Vermonters pay 8.9% of their family income. The largest tax burden in our state is on the middle 20% of our income earners, who together pay 10.5% of their family income on state and local taxes. Okay, add it all together, property taxes, your use taxes, your income taxes, they pay 10.5% of their family income on state and local taxes, while the wealthiest 1% pay 7.7%. In addition to this regressive tax burden on the middle class, which has grown from 9.5% of family income in 2002 to the 10.5% of today, real average wages in Vermont, as you sure know, adjusted for inflation, have been flat since 2007. And if you go back a little farther, are only up 2.9% since 2001. So we've got flat wages and a slightly growing regressivity of our tax system. The most regressive aspects of our tax system are the sales and use tax, which the current bills being discussed prioritize in the tax rebates, made possible by the carbon pollution tax. Okay, so this is, in Scott's analysis, is about tax reform. Also, the reinvestment in Vermont's green job sector, one of the growing parts of our economy, could help address stagnant wages. So in summary, we tax what we don't want, pollution. We shift taxes away from what we do want, jobs. This is what my profession has said for decades, since the 1920s, if you want to go back far enough. And invest in the only long-term viable future for our economy, one without non-renewable carbon-polluting energy. So thank you for the opportunity to testify, and I look forward to questions.
Thank you very much for your testimony.
Sure.
But you had mentioned about the sales tax, which in this bill goes from 6% to 5%. And is that 1% enough to bring about consider changes?
Yeah, I mean, part of what's buried in the modeling results here is, again, that how you recycle that money. So why I call it a conservative estimate is because how it's recycled now is just sort of assuming the expenditures of the average Vermonter across these different income classes. So that kind of sales tax, I mean, almost anything reinvest in the Vermont economy. If you take money from spending it on fossil fuels, something that we entirely import, and having that money available, so through, for example, the sales tax change, spend on whatever you want. So the model results speak for themselves in terms of that tax shift use. That's where you see the economic impact.
I'm hoping you'll make your testimony available on our website so that we can refer to it. I tried to listen and not take notes.
Sure, it's kind of a note-y sort of form. But
right.
Sure.
Because otherwise we can't refer back.
Sure.
Can you you talk more about the tax relief that businesses would see and the impact on that? I think that gets lost in the noise. You know, people only seem to focus on the increased costs that people are going to tell them that they're going to pay as a result of doing this.
Yeah, I really dug into it because the 5th edition was just released. I've got really good numbers on this tax study. If you look at corporate income taxes across New England, Vermont's kind of middle of the road. Connecticut's below us. Massachusetts is about the same. Maine has a big diversion from 3.5 all the way up to 9. We're at between 6 and 8.5, depending on deductions and everything. It's hard to kind of give it an actual number. We're right with what New Hampshire is. Rhode Island's above us. New York's about the same as us. So what's lost in the noise is the loss of jobs in one particular sector, right? So the people who sell us, to distribute fuel oil that we don't produce, or who sell it at the pump. But the potential gains, and you see this in this kind of revenue study, is that you can offset that loss elsewhere. So what you're seeing in the study is a net, right? There's losses, there's gains, there's winners, there's losers. The winners far outstrip the losers. If you do this thoughtfully and take the burden off of labor, take the burden, if you want, off of corporations, Vermont becomes a gainer on, we become a more employment-friendly state, we become a more business-friendly state, but we're taxing waste and...
But can you be more specific about what those tax reliefs would look like?
Well, that's up to the law. I mean,
what are some of the examples?
Yeah, so I can speak from other examples. I mean, British Columbia, by law, they had to be net neutral. And so they targeted some of the tax relief to the regressivity of the tax, so to low-income families and to rural households. And they protected some of the industries that they wanted to support in their economy through some of their targeted relief. I know agriculture is a concern. So it's been done a lot of different ways. The more broad-based energy taxes, the carbon tax in Germany, for example, was done in a very similar way, where they wanted to discourage waste and encourage work. So Germany was the classic example of taking advantage of the double dividend of pollution tax reform. They had chronic unemployment for years and years and years and years, chronic dependence on fossil fuels from outside their border. They taxed fossil fuels, recycled that money in their economy by lowering the tax burden on labor, brought down unemployment, and increased their own capacity to produce energy, such that on a sunny day in Germany now, close to 50 to 60% of their energy is produced by solar. This didn't happen just magically. It happened because of policy incentives.
But if we're to be successful in Vermont, somebody's got to paint a clear path of how that works. Because the only clear painting out there is that my gas is going to cost me 90 cents more, or whatever it is, 45 cents more. That's what they focus, and they can't focus on where they see the instant relief.
Sure.
And if there's instant relief to business, to employers and employees, how do we think that?
I can always say, if you're paying more at the pump, but you're paying less than other sales and use tax. You're paying more at the pump, but you're getting more in your paycheck to take home. You're encouraged to avoid this tax. This is the one case where we want to encourage tax avoidance, right? We don't want people to produce carbon pollution. And you're encouraged to use any extra money that you make from the tax shift into strategies like weatherization. And where you need the help, of course, is in the low-income families in Vermont. And I think it makes all the sense in the world to take 10 cents of every new dollar that's brought in and target that to these kinds of investments. That's where you, in the analysis, you get even bigger impact of this kind of policy. Not just by sort of giving it back to Vermonters and saying, spend it all on whatever you want, right? And just about any expenditure is better than spending on gas for the Vermont economy as a whole. But some of that be more targeted investment. And that's what British Columbia is currently looking at in their revisions.
Oh, I was just going to say, I think it would be easy to work out a number of, different scenarios of a a reduction in the Vermont corporate income tax by looking at total revenues that are produced in 2030, which looked like $600 million, and we decided that under one of the scenarios, I think 25% of that goes to reducing the corporate income tax. We'll pretty much calculate what is the reduction in the corporate income tax as a result of that policy choice. Obviously, that was just one policy choice. There's lots of different policy choices that could be made. I just had two questions. One, just following up on British Columbia's revenue neutrality. Maybe you've already answered this, but since there was a question about the impact of this type of tax on farmers, how did British Columbia deal with that? Do they every year specifically look at different sectors of the economy, different quintile groups, to see what the impact of the taxes on, whether it's neutral for that particular group?
My understanding was, I mean, the law was put in place, it ratcheted up to 2012. There was some adjustments made along the way about learning, oh, okay, we didn't do that, doesn't hurt this, let's fix that through amendments to the bill, basically. They went about having climate action tax credit, so they made it very clear that you're getting this tax credit here from paying higher at the pump here. So part of the success of carbon tax policies worldwide is transparency. People have to believe that they're going to see a reduction here and a gain here. It has to be very, very, in fact, national polls about whether people would be interested. It's tough to poll people and say, would you like to be taxed more? But if you frame it as, you're going to lose here but gain here, we get in national polls, we see upwards of 60% of people supporting a carbon tax, as long as they believe in the credibility of the government's ability to take it here and give it back here. So British Columbia had some experience with that along the way. They had annual benefits to northern and rural homeowners, so people who were really kind of vulnerable to higher gas prices. They had training tax credits for individuals and businesses, so they really sort of invested in helping train a workforce away from fossil fuels. They decided to protect the digital media sector in the province's film sector, so they said, let's use this as a way to protect and invest in an area of the economy so they didn't tie that so much to, and so they have other tax benefits. And so if it's the farming sector here, then how that would be structured would be a really important element. The simplicity of these tax bills is pretty important, though. You might remember a few years ago the U.S. had a carbon pollution tax bill that was being debated, but an actual carbon permit bill that was being debated in Washington, D.C. The challenge with that approach is that the bill was about this thick because it had every single kind of loophole that you can imagine to this credit, this credit, this credit. The advantage of the carbon tax is that it's very simple. There's very few entities that you have to tax, and then you can be very transparent and clear about how that tax comes back in other ways.
These are the states that you mentioned that are started down this path, California, Massachusetts,
Yeah.
Do you know where they are in the discussion?
I don't. I just was looking through the news feeds last night, and I know there's some. Probably Washington's getting the most press right now, so there's a coalition there that's been building for some time. Scott's group, Remy, has done an analysis for the Washington case and the California case and the Massachusetts case and the Vermont case and the national study. So they really have benefited from really understanding the economic dynamics in each of these cases. But yeah, I can't say that there's how far along they are. As Scott mentioned, Massachusetts likes to be first too, so.
California has a cap and trade system. Do you know what kind of discussions happening in California comparing their cap and trade to the carbon pollution tax?
Yeah, so much like the discussion here, the carbon tax discussion there is not to replace cap and trade, it's to go after carbon fuels that escape cap and trade. So
Supplement there.
Exactly. So particularly on the transportation sector. So the cap and trade has been really good at providing a degree of internalizing this external cost for the utility sector. And a few players, very well regulated, easy to keep track of who's got what permit and how they're bought and sold. But in the case of the rest of us who buy and sell energy every single day at the pump, for our homes, for our travel, the carbon tax is much cleaner, much more efficient, much easier to. So California is exploring in that sense. California is one of the states that already has some of the highest gasoline taxes in the country, and they've done that more for local pollution reasons and also to invest in their own clean transportation infrastructure. Of course, the challenge there is you're collecting tax from the fossil fuel users to reinvest in the fossil fuel infrastructure to encourage more fossil fuel use. So it's a bit, the history of energy taxes in our country have been a bit of a catch-22. They're not often, the history of energy taxes in our country have not generally been used to offset other taxes. They've been used to add new revenues.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, everyone.